Hi everyone. So as mentioned in our first online meeting of this course, content for this course is going to be delivered in two ways. First, through recorded lectures like this one that you can view at your own pace. I recommend, of course, that you watch them before we have our in-person sessions, which will be online until January 21st on Wednesdays and Fridays. And then hopefully after that, face-to-face. In our face-to-face sessions, the goal will be to go more in depth into some of these topics, have more conversations and discussions, and then I also have some exercises or activities that I'll be having you doing. But these pre-recorded lectures are meant to be exactly that, me delivering key concepts to you. Our first fundamental concept that we need to address is the subject matter for this course, or what is anthropology? Anthropology can be simply defined as the study of humans. And to me, that's the most exciting aspect of anthropology, is that if we have a discipline dedicated or devoted to the study of humans, that means that the possibilities in terms of what we can study that relates to humans is basically endless, right? We can study all aspects of humanity, and we'll talk about this in this course. So what this means, simply anthropology, extremely broad in scope. I would argue probably the most broad in scope of all of the different disciplines that are available to you. And you'll see throughout the term that as anthropologists, we can approach various subject matters, including studying ourselves, using the anthropological perspective, using field work and participant observation. So we have basically theory and method that unites us as a field, but our subject matters are extremely broad, right? Encompassing all varieties of people and cultures, all time periods. So I say that it's global and comprehensive, but increasingly it's not even global in terms of being limited to Earth. We can think about recent advancements. We can think about how even for the last decade plus, we've had humans living in space on the International Space Station. We now have equipment that is heading out across the galaxy. We have rovers and other human-made artifacts, which we'll talk about in our archaeology topic, on Mars. So even saying it's global, actually, I think is quite a misunderstanding. Basically, anything to do with humans, I would argue, is fair game for anthropologists to study. We do take what is called a four-field approach, however. So this is an image from your textbook outlining, the traditional fields of anthropology. And I'm going to go over each of these in turn. And you'll note that while we traditionally refer to this as the four subfields of anthropology, applied anthropology is increasingly being recognized as the fifth subfield, and indeed one that, as illustrated here, kind of overlaps or bridges the other four subfields. So, as I mentioned, I'm an archaeologist by training, and what that means is I study the past via material culture, or more broadly speaking, as your textbook defines it, archaeologists are interested in the cultural anthropology of the human past. So what do we mean by material culture? Well, we'll talk about this again in coming weeks, about artifacts and features and ecofacts and fossils. But I also like to emphasize that it's not just about tangible things that we can study, again, things like statues such as the Venus of Willendorf here, or walls such as in this Roman villa that was located in Germany. This is an image, a microscopic image of pollen. This is pine pollen. I know it's pine because it looks like Mickey Mouse. Or fossils, right? But it's not just these material things. It can also be immaterial things or intangible aspects that we can study as well. And as an archaeo gamer, one of the things I study is digital culture or digital artifacts. So it's not just material or physical culture, and it's not just old stuff, right? I study very contemporary technologies. And so archaeology is a contemporary as a whole field as well. I do also want to note, and again, we'll talk about this more in a couple of weeks, that archaeology is also not only taught within anthropology departments. So the approach that I take and my colleagues who are anthropological archaeologists take is a little bit different than scholars who have learned archaeology outside of anthropology proper. And again, this will become clear as we proceed throughout the term. Biological anthropology is the study of human and also including our non-human primate relatives, biology, and our evolution. And so some of the topics we're going to talk about that relates to this is how do we recognize difference in human biological variations? So we'll look at the cultural construction of race. We can look at osteology or human skeletal material, and we can also do comparative osteology and look at human anatomy as it compares again to our closest living relatives, the non-human primates. So primatology is a big field of this. We'll spend a couple of weeks looking at paleoanthropology, or the study of old humans, so humans and our direct ancestors and some of our indirect ancestors as well. So as you can see, biological anthropology is not just about studying fossils. It's not just about humans. And again, we'll spend a couple of weeks looking at this. Linguistic anthropology is admittedly one of the subfields that I have the least amount of training in, but it's one I find incredibly fascinating, and some of my dear friends are linguistic anthropologists. So it's the study of language, and I love this definition that comes through your text that says it's the study of language where it recognizes that language is a major carrier of important cultural information, right? So linguistic anthropology is different, as we'll talk about, from linguistics proper as a discipline, because it's situating language production and use within cultural contexts. And there's also this kind of recognition of the uniqueness of human language as well. So we'll talk about some of the differences between human language and non-human or animal forms of communication. Cultural anthropology is probably one of the most broadest fields because really what it looks at is culture, and we're going to define this in the next topic. So again, a definition that comes from our textbook is it's the study of human diversity, focusing on the behaviors and ideas that we have as members of our various cultural groups. And we're going to look at all the different ways that people organize themselves as members of society and how this shapes their worldview or their understanding of the world around them. And I just want to emphasize that this means culture in all of its different forms. So this includes everything from online cultures and communities that are built through things like MMORPGs like World of Warcraft, to pop culture. We'll talk about that a lot in this course because that's one of my interests, to kind of what we might call high art. So various forms of symbolic expression, including dance and music and art. So those are the four main subfields, but as I mentioned, increasingly we're recognizing applied anthropology as a critical part of the core makeup or composition of anthropology today. And indeed, one of my colleagues has designed a whole course on applied anthropology. And so applied anthropology is exactly that, the application of anthropological knowledge, insights, and information to real world problems, right? And so it's specifically meant and has a lot of its origins with drawing attention to some of the big bads that we have in human society. So what are some of the causes and underlying reasons for things like discrimination and other forms of social injustice, looking at things like crimes against humanity. So forensic anthropology is a critical piece of this, right? What do we do with individuals who are missing and murdered? How do we find them? How do we understand the processes that lead to people going missing, and all these various different aspects. And human rights are also central to this as well. So political anthropology is one of the subfields that applied anthropology often occurs. Medical anthropology, as you can imagine in our contemporary context of living under a pandemic, a lot of the insights from medical anthropology I think have really important lessons for us all in terms of moving forward through this pandemic and beyond. And then also, how are we going to learn from this pandemic in the future so that some of the serious consequences of it can potentially be avoided? Part of the reason why applied anthropology has become so widely accepted and adopted is because the reality is most of us are not employed like I am or my colleagues are at a university. We're not employed as academics. Most anthropologists or most people with training in anthropology don't ever actually wear anthropologist as a title. So they gain employment in a number of different means: nonprofits, non-government agencies, government organizations and agencies, businesses as various forms of consultants, etc. And so we'll talk more about this, but it comes with this recognition that the knowledge that we've obtained through anthropology as a discipline, while problematic in some ways, and we'll talk about some of these problems, is actually really useful for the world as a whole. And we can help drive solutions to some very, again, pressing real world issues that we're facing. So again, this can take the form sometimes in participating in programs that are meant to improve people's lives. Again, this might have a business or a political motivation in terms of supporting the work of, for example, a business that's looking to expand into a new region where there is a different cultural group with different language, and attempting to understand and deal with some of the barriers that might occur when we have cross-cultural interaction. And of course, governments can benefit greatly and do from the knowledge that is derived from anthropology in terms of things like some of the larger structures and institutions that shape our day-to-day experiences. So as you can imagine, anthropologists are very much interested in things like globalization. I imagine there'll be, again, a lot of work coming out of the pandemic around economic anthropology concerning like the supply chain issues we've had and whatnot. Some of the other motives is not simply just trying to make anthropologists employable, but rather some of it comes from the closeness of the people that we work with and work for, right? So anthropologists are increasingly hired by agencies and organizations who, again, are seek to doing better and understanding the world around them and the groups that they interact with better, right? So one of the issues we will talk about, however, is around things like improvement. If folks want, we can talk about some of the risks around something that was very popular before the pandemic, which is kind of volunteerism and stuff like that. So basically, the motivations behind applied anthropology may appear altruistic, but we also have to be aware of our own positioning and situation as an anthropologist and what that might mean in terms of how we are perceived and how our information and knowledge is received by the world at large. Something we'll talk about a lot in this course because it's very important to me and it's actually fundamental in anthropological practice and anthropology as a discipline is ethics. So one of the questions that comes out of applied anthropology is the issue about whether or not it's actually ethical to persuade people that change is needed, right? Or is it more important, is it a greater ethical issue if we don't try to help people when help is needed? And more importantly, when people ask for our help. And so in many regards, anthropologists' approach to ethics is very similar to what we see in like the medical community, that our first responsibility is to the people that we are studying, right? The people that we are helping or that we are working for or working with, right? So this involves several different kinds of responsibilities. And again, we'll see examples of this throughout the term around protecting people's welfare, privacy, confidentiality, and dignity, about reporting openly and truthfully about our findings. And we'll spend a whole week talking about how do we work with people, or a whole topic, how do we interact with people, what are our findings, how do we produce anthropological knowledge, and also then looking at what inclusion means. And I think applied anthropology in some regards is leading the way in terms of decolonizing our discipline. So decolonization and colonialism is also going to be another important topic we're going to look at this term. Okay. So a question I commonly get, and again, you might be interested at the very beginning of the term, especially if you're still looking at potentially switching out from this course into some of the other social science electives that are available to you at our excellent institution, is what are some of the things that you might take away from an anthropology course? And one of the things that we argue is resilience. And I realize that this is kind of a problematic term because there's a lot of talk about what resilience looks like, particularly again in the contemporary context we're in. But this includes things like social agility, right? The ability to move through and within different spaces, right? Different cultural spaces, to engage with different kinds of cultural groups. We're going to talk about things like bias and how this shapes our understanding of the world around us. And so a lot of that social agility comes from just being self-aware. And so we'll talk about this throughout the course. Social sensitivity, again, just being culturally sensitive, being aware that there are distinctions that exist in terms of how people may recognize gender, for example, can be really critical. And part of this is also contextualization as well, right? Is recognizing that what might be occurring in a particular context context or what might be appropriate there may be inappropriate in others, right? And so these are some of the hallmarks that are critical for what we would consider an individual to be really resilient, right? Flexible, adaptable, self-aware, have great agility and sensitivity, etc. Critical thinking is also really important, right? So accuracy in interpreting behaviors, particularly of others, we'll talk about this. Our ability to appropriately challenge conclusions. So we spent some time in our first lecture, or our first meeting, I should say at least, talking about the discussion ground rules. And really these form a baseline for us to do this, to appropriately challenge our conclusions. And also to part of critical thinking is around our assumptions we might have about the various perspectives that we bring to the table and social perspectives in broadly. And of course, there's so many other skills that can be taken away from an anthropology course. And one of the tasks I think I'll assign to you this early in the term is throughout the term, push yourself and think about and keep track of the various skills that you're learning or you're picking up or you're adapting throughout this term. And we'll talk about them at the end when we do our summary. Okay, so that's all the topic, that's all the information or content I had for this topic. I look forward to discussing this with you during our next Collaborate session. Bye for now.